Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Rocky Mountain YouTube channel. My name is Chase, and today I am joined with TJ Bronson from 891 Suspension. So TJ's a local here in Utah. He works with a lot of the pros here in Utah, and you know, we've been working together a lot at the local races. I've been racing a lot this summer, and I thought it'd be cool to get TJ out here. We're at OCA MX today, and do some suspension talk with you guys. And one of the video ideas that we had was, let's just talk about the most common mistakes that TJ as a suspension tech sees that riders are making. So if you have a brand new bike or maybe bought a used bike, whatever it might be, these tips are just gonna help you out to know the things that you should and should not be doing when you're trying to get your suspension set up. And we're here just actually talking, TJ, you and I a little bit, and you said, hey, first things first, you'd be surprised at how many people come in with their clickers not set correctly as just a starting point.
It's more common than a lot of people think. A bike comes from the manufacturer, a dealer puts it together, and they ship it out the door to you. A lot of the time, even those technicians there in the dealership won't balance them. So they don't know,
So
they're just there to
one
build the
fork
bike.
is in more than the other, like 8 clicks in on one, 10 on the other,
Yeah,
kind of a thing.
I mean, I've seen it to the extremes of fully open and fully closed. And
Okay.
in theory, the manual does say to put them right in the middle
Yeah.
for your initial starting procedure.
Okay, so just make sure your clickers and everything are set where they should be before you start this. But that leads us to tip number one is no matter what bike you get, every bike is set when they come from the OEMs. They're trying to make a target range for, you know, a lot of different riders, and they have a weight range that they have. And it's really important that you have the correct spring rates. And TJ, explain to us what springs are doing in the fork and shock, kind of their role, their main role, and why you need to have the spring rates correct.
A lot of it is just the balance of the chassis overall. From there, then we start to talk about sprung weight and unsprung weight, but having them set for you as the rider, just because there is such a broad range from the manufacturers, we can dial it in, get you a little bit closer to start working with the stock stuff that we have there. When we have, for a rider that's underweight for what the bike is, if the springs are too stiff in the front, he's not even getting into the valving. The same happens in the rear, and vice versa. If you have a rider that is on the heavier side from what the manufacturers put in the bike, he's going to be too low in the stroke, already overcome the valving, and relying too much at the bottom versus being able to use everything that's there. So springs are there to help hold you and the bike weight up, and then let the valving kind of take the smaller stuff into play.
Okay, so that was gonna be my next question, is like, how does the spring rate affect valving? And that makes sense. So you're saying if you're not sprung correctly, you're not letting the valving do its job, how it's designed to do.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Again, if you're too stiff, you're not even opening the valving that's inside.
Makes sense.
If you're too soft, it's already wide open, you're at the bottom.
Interesting. Okay, so tip number one, that's why you need to make sure, like I said, they have a window, and there's ways that you can check what shock spring and what fork springs you're gonna need, and that leads us to tip number two, which is you need to have your sag set correctly. You wanna check your sag, and there's more to sag than you think. So TJ, overall balance of the bike, you know, everybody talks about sag, but kind of give your input. Why is sag so crucial when you get a bike set up?
It is probably the single most biggest adjustment we can make to a chassis for a rider, aside from getting into the personal side and tailor making everything to a rider. When we're talking about sag, we're talking about how high the rear end or how low the rear end sits. It will change the way the whole chassis reacts. When you're coming into a corner, if sag is too high or too small of a number and the rear end is riding too high, it's going to understeer. You're going to knife the front end. It's not going to track through a corner very well. And on the flip side of that is if it's too low, it's going to pass the rear end and the front end's going to be really wobbly. You're going to feel like you're riding a wheelie everywhere. There's no control to the front end. So it really helps the balance of the bike.
Sure.
Just to keep the wheels planted to where they should be so that you're not upsetting one end of the bike or the other. The manufacturers do a lot of R&D into this to find the proper balance of a chassis.
Okay. Do riders check their sag often enough? And how often should you be changing sag depending on track conditions?
No, people do not check it enough. It's one of the first things that I'll go to with a bike. When a rider comes to me with any questions about handling, whatever, I ask them, what's your sag at? Oh, I don't know.
They haven't checked it forever, right?
So they have no idea. So that's the first adjustment I'm going to make, is I'm going to properly balance this bike out.
As long as their clickers are where they should be too, right?
In theory, yes. Yeah. So with the sag, it's not just set it and forget it either. Your axle, your rear axle will play a role in this because it's a leverage ratio. Too far back, makes it easier, more leverage. It'll actually allow more sag.
So if you put a new chain and sprocket on and you move that wheel in a little bit, you've just changed your sag number.
Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of the time it's going to change 1, 2, maybe a tops of 3 millimeters.
Okay.
Even though you're thinking you've moved your chain that far, but 1 to 3 millimeters of a balance of a chassis is massive. I recommend that you check it while the bike is cold. Usually at each track, you're adjusting your chain. You should adjust your chain before every race or every time you go out. Should be one of the things you're checking on your bike. If you're checking it often, just like you do tire pressures, everything else, you'll always be at that perfect
right
number.
Amount, yeah.
And again, go back to the OEMs. They have a number set. When they make a bike, with that spring everywhere, we can test it right there. We'll know what static is, what rider sag is, and we want to stay at that number as much as possible.
Okay.
We do change it depending on the track, but it is not checked often enough. It's one of the things that needs to be checked.
Okay, so that was a lot of information on sag, but that's just because it is so crucial, checking your sag often, and it really affects the ride characteristic. And also, I do want to point out too, TJ, this is important when we're talking about this, you got to make sure your form's correct. If you're sitting too far back on the bike or too far forward, whatever it might be, depending on the corner, the conditions, you might be feeling something that's not necessarily the bike's problem, it's rider technique. So that is one thing you do want to be mindful of, is maybe have somebody watch you ride too, just to see your body language on the motorcycle. All right, tip number 3, or third most common issue we see, TJ, is thinking that any problem can be fixed just with your clickers. So if somebody's got a stock motorcycle, they're riding it, maybe they're sprung correctly, but they just can't figure out how to get comfort out of a bike with stock clickers. You're a suspension tech, so obviously you're gonna say, hey, revalve, but like really, what would you tell somebody in that situation? Why would they wanna get their suspension revalved?
There's gonna be a lot to it. You go get a suit from the tailor down the street, you buy a suit, you're not just gonna walk out of the store with that suit, right?
Right.
Because it's super big, it's super wide, or it's super tight. But when you're getting into racing and trying to get that edge on the competition, you want something that's tailor-made to you. So we take all of your info, all weight, all of this, skill level, all of this into consideration, and the type of riding you're doing. And then we can take this bike and make it strictly for you.
Right.
There's no one set that's quite like the other. You know, what you like is not quite what I like or anybody else out there. You know, one guy might want a stiffer front end and a little bit softer rear end. So we can take all that in, really dial this bike to fit your needs. Okay. What you feel on the track versus what the next guy feels, they're just not gonna be the same.
And it was kind of interesting. You said that no matter what bike, even with suspension that's been redone or revalved, you said that if a rider has to kind of go 4 to 6 clicks in either direction, you'll want to go back in there and actually revalve it.
Yeah, a lot of the time, yes. If we're going that big, we want to rely more on the valving than we do our clickers. Our clickers are there just to take fine tune. Yeah. If we're making massive adjustments, we do want to get back in there. We want to, if it's stiffer, softer, whatever, we want to get that a lot closer for you.
Okay.
Clickers are just, hey, today's track's really muddy. Let's soften
clicks.
this out.
Okay.
You know, or today's really hard packed. I'm not getting the traction I need. Let's, you know, 1, 2, 3 clicks. Let's get in there. When we start getting too far into clicks, we look at valving, we look at oil, we look at spring rates again. Like it just compounds.
Okay. So there you go. So if you feel like with your stock suspension you just can't get the comfort, it might be because you just need to get your suspension revalved. All right, so the common mistake number 4 that we see, that we were talking about, TJ, and you said you see this all the time, is riders not making adjustments to their clickers because they have a fear that they don't know what the clickers do, what it's gonna change, and so they just end up not doing anything.
Yeah, they're really afraid that they're gonna hurt the bike. And the biggest concern to me would be hurting yourself, essentially. The bike will be fine. If you make an adjustment, don't be afraid to go back the other way.
Right.
You know, that's one thing. Guys are like, oh, I kept going in. Well, it wasn't working. Well, go back the other way. That didn't work. Go back the other way. They're very easy to use. Don't be afraid to use them. You know, if it feels like you're at the bottom of the stroke, stiffen it up a little bit on the forks. If it feels like you're at the top of the stroke, soften it a little bit. Open it up, let it float a little more.
Okay.
You know, with the shock, we've talked about this a lot.
Yeah.
The high speed, nobody knows what it does.
And yeah, and I remember I went to TJ at a track and I was like, hey, shock's feeling harsh. And he told me to do something that I wasn't expecting. We took away some sag, so we kept the bike a little bit higher, and we went in on the high speed, which was not the direction that I thought I needed to go. So that's also, I think, a huge advantage to having your suspension revalve with somebody like TJ or maybe Trace Tech, whoever.
Don't be afraid to come ask us.
Yeah,
you know,
even if you don't bring a
rider. Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of guys are like, I'm not fast enough to say like, oh, what do I do?
It's going to make a difference for me. You would be surprised. Come talk to us. We're friendly. We like talking about this stuff.
Okay, well there it is. Don't be afraid to make changes. Don't be afraid. Even if you've never done your suspension, these guys a lot of times are at tracks or at practice at races, and it's just an easy way for them to get your business. So go over to suspension people and tell them what you're feeling, and they can help you out, and maybe that'll help you decide, you know what, let's go get my suspension revalved. So that's the common mistake number 4, is not making changes because you don't understand it and you're maybe scared. All right, we're almost done, I promise, but there's a lot of good information in this video. But the last common mistake, this is something that TJ really wanted to talk about, is over torquing or just not torquing things correctly. We're talking about triple clamps, your steering stem bearing, your linkages, and a very common one is not installing the front wheel correctly. So TJ, walk us through it.
So a lot of the time, guys just take their forks out, put them back in after they've been serviced, take the T-handle, wrench them down. Whether it's
I've done
the
that.
ratchet wrench, whatever, they'll just crank them down. It creates a lot of bind in the front end at that point.
And by binding, you saying like the fork is not gonna be able to move freely.
Correct, yeah. So it transitions through. You have bushings there and everything else in there that they'll catch.
Okay.
They won't go all the way through.
Creates drag, stiction.
Yes.
Okay.
And you can actually wear out the inside of the tube.
Oh.
So there is proper torque. A lot of the time we're 16, 14, 16, 15, somewhere right around there.
Foot-pounds.
Foot-pounds,
Your
yes.
service manual will tell you, or you can call your suspension guy.
Or the dealerships. If you're afraid to call any of them, call the dealership.
Okay.
Your local dealership should have all these on file. The next one would be your front wheel. You mentioned it, the front wheel being installed properly. There's a shank that's on your front axle that allows your forks to kind of float. We call it a floating front end. If that's not done properly, you'll bind again and not allow that fork to move in and out. I've also seen where those are either way too tight or way too loose. It does all play a role in that.
The fork lug nuts we're talking about.
Yes,
okay.
down there, your fork pinch bolts. So there are proper torques, there are proper sequences to do these. It's not like just tighten one bolt, tighten the next, and we're good.
We have a how-to video that goes through that because it is so important.
Perfect. The next thing would be your steering bearings. Guys neglect these often. They either over torque them, under torque them, or don't even grease them. There needs to be grease. They need to be checked often, a couple times a year. Because if that gets too sloppy, too much play, again, the front end feels different with the suspension. Moving back towards the back of the bike, you have your swing arm pivot, your linkages. There's proper torque on those as well. If they're too loose, the bike moves too much, isn't designed to be super loose, so you'll have more flex in the chassis. If it's over torqued, it's too rigid, it's not flexing enough.
Okay.
They do also need to be greased. If they're not greased, it creates a problem with the suspension, the whole chassis feel, everything. It creates a bind again.
So that does it. That's kind of our most 5 common mistakes that you and I have seen, or that you've seen specifically. Last little bonus tip we'll just talk about real quick is, we all know it, you gotta service your shock and your forks, change the oil, your bushings and your seals as often as you need to. TJ, you were talking about it. Oil breaks down after a certain point, some sooner than others. But anyway, that does it. Thank you so much for tuning in, TJ. Hey man, really appreciate the video. So if you live in Utah or anywhere around here and you want to have your suspension done, TJ from 891, he does a phenomenal job. You graduated from MMI. He's been doing this his whole life. And like I said, I can geek out on this stuff, and TJ is not afraid to talk to you. In fact, don't go to TJ if you only have 20 minutes because you're gonna be there an hour. So, but anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, get subscribed to the Rocky Mountain YouTube channel. Remember, we have those how-to videos. We have those other suspension videos that are just kind of educational on what clickers do. So be sure to give those a watch. So again, TJ, thank you. I'm Chase the Rocky Mountain, and we'll see you on the trails.